Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Crosswires. It's James here, and today's episode we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper look at why retro, why people are interested in retro, because we've done a few episodes about different systems, and in fact, one of my guests today has been on the show before to talk about the Amiga, but I wanted to take a little bit of a look at, why it's so interesting, what it is, and maybe some of the fascination. So, would you please welcome back to the show Dan Wood, and our new guest, both from a Retro Hour, Ravi Abbott.
Hey, James.
Hey.
Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for jumping on. And Ravi especially, I think we should probably say, due to a miscommunication on my part, I hadn't actually got Ravi scheduled in. And Ravi has very kindly taken a break from ironing in his shorts to come and record with us today.
That's it. It's a very hot day here. So, yeah, I was just trying to get through the ironing.
And that's Ravi's favourite pastime as well. So for him make use and come off it's pretty hardcore.
It's quite retro ironing, isn't it?
Oh, I like that. What have you got? A Commodore iron?
One of the coal ones that you heat up.
Oh, my nana's still got one of those somewhere in my house. They are fascinating. In fact, actually, no, she's got. Do you remember when irons used to have like really chunky, like almost corduroy cords?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it was on like the wire was like wrapped with material as well.
Yes, exactly. That's what she had for years and years, and it started to frame. My granddad had put like electrical tape around it and, done various little hacks. Anyway, we're not here to talk about ironing. We are here to talk about retro. So before we start, you both run the Retro Hour podcast, and Dan, you did tell me the last time we spoke how long it's been going, but do you want to give a little bit of an introduction to yourselves and to Retro Hour, just so people know, who we're talking to and, get excited?
Yeah, well, I think what we've been going now, 7.5, is it 7.5 years?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, which is crazy. It'll be, I think 8 years in January. And yeah, it's a weekly podcast, comes out every Friday. The idea of it when we first began was really to not only kind of represent the British gaming scene and technology scene a bit more in terms of retro, because there were a lot of other podcasts out there, but most of them, like Retronauts, shows like that, tended to cover it from the American perspective. So you got a lot of stories about, the NES and the Atari 2600, not so much about systems like the Amiga. So that was one thing that we wanted to kind of readdress that balance a little bit, but also to, because our show, not only do we do kind of a roundup of the news that's been happening in retro over the last week, but the second half of the show is an interview section where the idea is that we get on a veteran of the industry. So that could be, we've had former CEOs and presidents of companies on. We've had guys that did graphics for games back in the day. We've had programmers, musicians from all these different companies that made the games that we grew up playing. So the idea was to really find out kind of, from the horse's mouth, what went into the creation of these games that we played as kids, really, and to kind of get the story of the industry from the very beginning up to around 20 years ago. That's kind of our cut-off point around the year 2000. Yeah, when we originally started doing it, we thought, yeah, we'll get a guest on every week. That'll be easy. 7.5 years later, we're still managing to get guests on every week, but we probably didn't realize how ambitious that was when we first began, but luckily it's continued.
Also, and it's great. I know you've had some great guests. Obviously, we share a guest in that we've both had Stu Cambridge on the show, and Stu is just such a nice guy to work with. He really is. Now, am I correct? Oh, is it Dan Vincent who we've had on the show recently to talk about desktop publishing? We were talking about Stuart Chaffee from the Computer Chronicles. Correct me if I'm wrong. You guys have had him on the show?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. That was a really good score. Dan was really, really into Computer Chronicles. Like, I only saw Computer Chronicles once it came online. I wasn't aware of it, but then there was lots of old episodes that you could kind of go through. And I was like, wow, this is really like a turning point because, I don't think it was actually rebroadcast in Europe. We had our own kind of shows like, was it Computer Live and Tomorrow's World and stuff like that.
Yeah, because it was obviously a very big show in America. And I'm the same, I kind of discovered it when it came. Originally, they're on archive.org, I think they're all on YouTube now as well. Obviously, Stuart, he presented that show. I think it started in like 1980. So it was kind of right there at the start of the microcomputer boom. And, he's very well placed, in Silicon Valley. And it's really as a time capsule kind of looking back at all of those early episodes and seeing how the computer revolution kind of grew from the start. So again, Stuart was kind of documenting it as it happened. So it was really interesting to get his perspectives and, his memories of doing the show. And yeah, obviously Gary Kildall as well, who some of your listeners might be familiar with, was a co-host of it. And the founder of the CPM operating system. Bit of a tragic tale, he passed away when he was quite young, but it was also interesting to hear kind of Stuart's perspective on kind of his war with Bill Gates and Microsoft and kind of why the market didn't go CPM's way and his memories of working with Gary. So, yeah, I really enjoy having Stuart on. He's, definitely a figurehead in the early computer industry.
Yeah, and I think I echo that in terms of the Computer Chronicles. I don't remember watching it growing up, but I certainly remember something similar. I mean, so we had cable. We had Bell Cable Media, which then became NTL, which then eventually became Virgin Media, but we had analog cable, and there was one channel, the Jones Computer Network, and it had loads of not old, but it had loads of computer programs, and I just seem to, I have a vague recollection of the Computer Chronicles and another vague recollection of an early Leo Laporte show. But I grew up, as I've taught previously, I grew up with an Amiga, but I missed out on so many of the earlier developments in tech and in computing. And it's really, for me, retro is really interesting to learn about that history. And I think the one thing that's always still stuck with me is, I think we can be proud somewhat as British retro fans that, one very popular computer over here, the BBC Micro and the whole Acorn line, well, we can trace back the roots of every mobile processor to those systems because of ARM.
It's I think it was called the Screensavers, which was the early Leo Laporte show. But
that's
the Screensavers, that was a really kind of experimental one as well. Yeah, I think it's really important. Like when we did the podcast, as Dan was saying earlier, like the time period of computing, the developments have been so fast that there's a lot of stuff that kind of gets lost, and especially like the British systems and all of the obscurities we had and like all the weirdness. And I think it's really important to kind of cover that stuff. And even just seeing like footage from like 5 or 10 years ago, like, you look at the history of cinema and it took so long to go to sound and then so long to go to color, and it's just computers. It's like lightning compared to that, how fast it's gone. So it's really important to kind of just get all those stories and even watch some of those older shows. I do remember Screensavers and had an amazing episode, which was Kevin Mitnick, who was the most notorious hacker in history, and he was banned off using the internet during the days of Mosaic and the early browsers. And then they were like, right, Kevin, you have to go on the internet now. Your ban has been lifted by the courts. And he hadn't even like Googled his own name, I think it was Yahoo back then. But he hadn't done a vanity search or anything, and he did that live on the TV, and he was like, what are these pop-ups and stuff? It was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and the web's come so far. I mean, I think back to the early days, it says of Mosaic. My first experience was, even back in the day, I was much more of a Netscape fan than an Internet Explorer fan.
Oh, same, yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Like, I had all my email in, was it Netscape? What? Oh, because was it Composer?
That was their suite they released, wasn't it? I think with Netscape 3, when you could actually make websites and everything in it as well. It kind of, for my case, it got a bit bloated around that era. I must admit, it kind of slowed down my machine, but yeah, I was a big fan of Netscape.
I miss a lot because Netscape morphed. I say morphed. There are traces of Mozilla. Mozilla, I think, was the open source side of Netscape.
It was the Mozilla project that came out of Netscape. And like thinking about that, we're one of the generations that barely had mobile phones and barely kind of had the internet as well. We really didn't have the internet. It just arrived. But the generation before us wouldn't have had, home computers. It would have been a brand new thing for them as well. So it's really like each generation's getting these kind of technological advances. But I really do think the time that we were in with the internet, that was a real big change. I think it's a lot bigger than, say, social media and stuff that's happening now with the next generation. Just the whole idea of the world being unconnected and then connected together is just, it's insane when you think about it.
Yeah, well, the last generation, I suppose, who had, an analog childhood and then a digital adulthood.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Absolutely. And it does show, you see, I always hold up my parents as an example, but my parents, digital things don't quite come as naturally to them as we would maybe to us. Things like it was always me who had to program a video recorder when we went on holiday.
That was an art. That was programming the video recorder.
Oh gosh, yeah. And I mean, I remember when Video Plus came along, and like,
yeah, the numbers.
I don't know if Video Plus a thing outside of the UK. It was very interesting how that worked. That's for a whole different episode. Let me ask you guys this. Obviously, I know, Dan, we know your first machine was a Commodore Plus 4, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So you were firmly in the Commodore route. But Ravi, you'll have to forgive me, I'm not really sure of your origin story. What was your first sort of introduction to computing?
We had a kind of thing where my dad was like, and he still is, he's the pusher of technology. So he'd always embrace the latest technology, even if it was broken. He'd still embrace it. So he had one of those mobile phones that was, a side case that you had to carry and have a mobile phone on there and stuff. And he's always pushing it. Even today, he's still got like the latest stuff, but it's a bit chaotic because, it's hard for him to kind of get on with a lot of the new stuff. Always has been. But with me, it was the Amstrad. So kind of coming from the like Indian background, there was a lot of stuff about accountancy and business and stuff like that. And the Amstrad was a machine that all my uncles got my mum into. And they were like, this has WordStar on it, which was the big word processor back then. And my mum had kind of abandoned the machine later on. So it was I think it's a 1510, or it's like a PCW. It's the one after the PCW, the kind of desktop MS-DOS clone.
Oh, yeah, the PC 1510.
Yeah, I think it was 1510. It was a number combo like that.
Yeah, was that the one which had dual floppies?
Yeah, but it was, 5.12 inch, or the big fat floppies, basically.
Yeah.
The ones that were actually floppy.
Yeah, the ones that were actually floppy. And that machine was like, it was just given to me. So it was like the computer in the house, and they'd moved on to other machines and stuff. My dad had an Amiga 2000 upstairs and stuff, but I had this old machine, and I remember playing Missile Command on there, and then I think I had a few upgrades in there, so I managed to push it to like a really early version of Wolfenstein on there, which was pretty awesome. But that was like a DOS compatible machine as well, and yeah, that was my kind of roots, coming through the like word processing world and thinking, wow, I can actually do something different to this. And that was really when word processing was like, if you had to do italics and stuff, you'd select it with a color, and you'd only see the output once it was printed afterwards. But there was a whole thing about electronic typewriters as well, which was another thing where you had typewriters with little LCD screens. Lots of people, because my mum did a PhD and stuff, so she was writing her PhD on these like electronic typewriters, and it's really mad if you think about it now. And a lot of people were doing that kind of education and word processing on these machines, and accountancy as well was a big kind of thing.
And that would have shook up a lot of small business, being able to do your accounts on computer rather than paper and have, electronic records.
Yeah. Because there'd always be somebody, you'd always have an old lady on the street or somebody who knew maths pretty well that would be like the accountant for the area and, the smaller business and would handle the books. But I guess a lot of people kind of suddenly that changed, and that job was kind of cut out of a lot of people's life.
Yeah, that's true. I remember I studied bookkeeping once, and I was very glad when we moved on to electronic bookkeeping, because doing it on paper isn't fun. But thanks, Ravi. I mean, it's very different angles, because obviously, Dan, you're more on sort of the non-PC bandwagon to start with. I mean, obviously, Ravi, you're full-blown MS-DOS from day one.
Yeah.
Whereas, me and Dan are on the, stick with disk in and the thing works.
Well, that was the thing. So my dad had an Amiga upstairs in the attic, but I wasn't allowed in there because that was the serious machine, because he did a fine art. He's a university lecturer, so he was like doing a lot of animation and stuff on there. But it was a 2000, a really early 2000, and later on, I got onto that machine, and then I dropped the Amstrad. I was just like, no, get onto that. But originally, my very first computer was that big desktop machine with the lovely humming CRT and the really nice keyboard, actually. Yeah, really kind of mechanical keyboard.
Which is surprising, considering it's Amstrad. I would have thought it would be just, like papier-mâché.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can imagine Lord Sugar doing that, really. You know, anyway.
Fruits and apples.
So, what is it? Do you think? Because you know, you obviously talk about the cut-off point for what you guys look at in terms of retro is about year 2000, and I'd agree with that. I think anything after the 2000s, I wouldn't even really call it retro. I don't think of the PS3 and above as retro systems yet. Maybe the PS2, maybe the GameCube, and they were what, 2002-ish?
Yeah.
2001, I think both of those came out, yeah. And the Dreamcast was a bit earlier. That was 99.
I'm starting to regard the 360 as retro, though. There's part of me which is like, I guess it's like memories and stuff like that. The cutoff for me is starting to move a bit.
Well, that came out in 2005, didn't it? So I mean, it's knocking on for 20 years.
And I guess, to be fair, you're probably starting to consider the Wii as retro as well now.
Yeah. It feels retro when you use it nowadays.
But do you know what? Out of all those systems, I don't know what it is, but Wii, for me, is at least it's still retained a lot of its entertainment values. I can still have and we do have a lot of fun at family Christmas and stuff with Wii Sports Bowling. Even though Nintendo Switch Sports is out, I haven't picked it up yet. The graphics don't really matter.
Yeah.
I've got a friend who, isn't into the retro scene, and the reason he's not is he says, "Oh, I wouldn't want to play anything with such awful graphics." And I don't get that because, some of the most charming games have not, because of the fact that they were on systems that just didn't have that horsepower.
I think that the Wii was the way that the Wii really feels retro is, stuff like the 360 introduced online gaming, and it all went online, and we brought back the cooperative all in the living room playing. And I think that was an old style of playing that had kind of been lost and forgotten. And I think that kind of co-op play, making that the primary focus, really gives it that kind of retro feel.
Do you know what? I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really good point because, when, back in the day, I keep saying this, it makes all three of us sound really old. And compared with some of our listeners, in my day, lad, get off that lawn. Right. If we wanted to play games with a friend, we would have to have them come round. And they'd either bring their own controller or you'd have a spare. And I don't know about you two, but my friends would always get the cheaper controllers.
Yeah, you'd always have the second-hand one or something, or the third-party one, and you'd have the official.
Yeah, my brother would normally play with the knockoff one.
Yeah. But, bringing this together, and I remember so much of, having people actually bring round their PCs, the Windows 95 PCs in the late 90s to play Command & Conquer over the network.
Yeah, well, we used to do it with Amiga 500s. My friend Ricky would bring his over, and we'd link them up with a null modem cable, and we'd play head-to-head Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, because you could actually have, with two separate TVs or two monitors, you could actually race each other using them, and Battle Chess was another game.
Yes, yeah.
Where you could actually have your own screen, which obviously helped a lot for a game like chess. But there were certain games, that we were networking. God, that must have been about 93, 94 we were doing that.
Yeah, right. I remember we used to have a group called LAN Arena, which were actually a company that would come in Nottingham into areas like bars and stuff, and they would set up huge LAN games, and you would be playing Unreal Tournament and stuff like that on the LAN. But we'd also be then all meeting up online and doing it. But I really think Halo was the kind of one that people would all play together on split screen.
Yeah.
And then the Wii was the real kind of cooperative ones. But after that, it really, really kind of got out of fashion. And then the Wii just brought it back with a big hit straight away.
So I want to ask you, what is it for both of you? Obviously, we've grown up with those systems, but now we've all got much more modern computers. We've got modern gaming systems. What is it for, and we'll go in reverse order this time. I'll start with you, Ravi. What is it for you that makes you still want to keep going with those older systems and keep collecting and keep doing things with retro hardware and retro gaming?
For me personally, it's I do enjoy the kind of looking back and, getting the old feels and stuff, but it's really about pushing them to their limits. And that's because a lot of I feel like they're lost systems, or they're like lost architectures, and it's a bit of a kind of lost knowledge. I understand it as well. So, like modern systems, I get them, and there's a lot of issues, but you can just go onto Google and search for it and stuff. But it takes me back to those days where you had to learn a computer and you had to go, right, this didn't work with that, and you'd make your mistakes. Even just the basic stuff of like sitting next to a CRT and turning that on and realizing that these displays were actually really amazing and something unique, and they had that like warm kind of halogen-y kind of feel where new machines don't have that. And even if I just show one of my little cousins, a CRT, they think it looks great, and it's a real weird kind of human thing, I guess, and especially with like regards to the Amiga and pushing that. And I've started working with PowerPC stuff as well and pushing that. I just really think it's like it's a lost world, or it's like a kind of a different place that we haven't been for a long time, and I like to go back to that place. Or I kind of feel comfortable there. Like I've got the latest fast ARM processor and all of this with the new Mac M1 and stuff, and I enjoy using it. I can get work done fast, but I don't want to fiddle with it as much as I do with the older stuff. And the older stuff is probably as expensive as the new machines. I feel I can get more hands-on with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there was more that you had to do for yourself, and more you had to understand. I have a fond memory of me and my dad. We got in a book on Amiga DOS, and we were actually going through Amiga DOS together.
Yeah, and it felt like you were more focused on it, and you were learning more. Like it was actually about a learning process, and you're building a knowledge base, where now you can just Google something, go on a forum, oh, that's how it's done. Do that, copy and paste a command, boom. And it kind of feels like you're missing out the kind of trial and error process of it.
Because you're right. You go on YouTube, you go on Google, there's a tutorial for almost everything.
Yeah. Someone
has created some tutorial. And ironically, of course, when we talk about retro computing and modding your systems, well, Dan's partly responsible for those tutorials.
Yeah.
If I want to go and look up what Amiga accelerators are possible, and maybe things about the Pi Storm, well, Dan's videos come up.
I just used to remember that we'd have limited resources. We have no connectivity to the internet, and it would be like, I can't get this installer to work for the Amiga. So what would I do? I was really young. I didn't know. I'd search for all my disks, and I'd just find a version of the disk that had hidden the installer files on it. There was a one that worked with it, and then I copy it over to my workbench, and then suddenly I'm installing the software. And it was that kind of process of just hitting it, and like as people used to say, like peeking and poking, and kind of getting stuff working that way.
Because I'm already said to Ravi, we need to get him on to a show to discuss this in more detail. But you've done a load of stuff in terms of music, pushing old Amiga hardware and other hardware to where it probably would have never gotten pushed back in the day.
Yeah, and that's what I love. Like the people now, the scene seems to be full of people really, really pushing stuff, like and just doing it for the fun of it as well. It's not to make money or huge things like that. It's like people are creating crazy games for old systems, and like, I saw the Commodore PET playing video the other day and stuff, and it's like someone's just doing that for the sake of it, and like the kind of learning process.
Yeah, no one's going to go out and buy a PET to watch YouTube.
No, yeah.
But like the fact that you can do it is fantastic. And looking back at all sorts of retro, not just computing, but technically it's computing. I mean, someone in the RMC Retro Discord was selling their old Palm Pilot.
Yeah.
And do you know what? I nearly bought that. I thought because I had a Palm. I had a Palm Tungsten T2. Admittedly, this is this is early 2000s. This is around that point where the very early handheld devices that, again, we look at now, like the concept of a PDA. What's a PDA? We've all got smartphones that have got massively more power.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think it's back then it was for the passion of it. Like One thing that really interested me was the BBS ASCII art scene.
Oh, yes.
And the rivalry between groups. They would create that art for the sake of creating art and outdoing the other person. It wouldn't be for clicks, or it wouldn't be for, to make it popular or anything. It'd just be like, I've done this because I want to, outdo this guy that's done that. And it was just a real kind of like inventory, kind of like tinkering kind of thing, and for the challenge, and that's what I really enjoy.
Awesome. And Dan, what about yourself? I mean, obviously you've been creating YouTube content, particularly around the Amiga, but obviously other systems as well. I do have to ask you, by the way, how much penance did you have to do after having an Acorn Archimedes in your possession?
Yeah, that was it wasn't a cheap acquisition. Again, I think it kind of goes back to kind of what Ravi said in some ways for me. It's the fact that using these machines does kind of transport me back to being a kid again. I mean, if I boot up an Acorn Archimedes and I'm using RISC OS, then, I feel like I'm 12 years old in the classroom at school again, using that, playing Lander and stuff like that. We used to play on it. And there's definitely a big element of that in there. And, using my Commodore Plus/4, playing the games I used to when I was 7, 8 years old, takes me back to those long, endless summer days with my friends over when I was a kid. And, there is definitely an element of that. But I think also there's a bit of maybe a completionist kind of angle from me as well. For example, now I've got, an Amiga 4000 and I've got an Amiga 3000 and a 2000. And, these are machines that when I was a kid, I would see them in magazines and, see the prices. I think the Amiga 4000 went for about £2,500 in 1992 at its stock configuration. Always looked at them in magazines, never saw them in person, and always kind of dreamed about owning one, be there like, one day. And, it took 30 years for that day to come around, but I finally got one about 10 years ago. So I think there's definitely an element of kind of the things I wanted when I was younger, I can now explore as well. But also, I mean, I've got some systems that I wasn't aware of and had no connection to when I was a kid. Like I got my hands on a Sinclair QL a couple of years ago, which was, it was meant to be like the serious computer from Sinclair, aimed at small businesses and education, mainly meant for like, small office kind of productivity kind of stuff. It was a complete failure. But I think there's also something quite interesting in those stories where technology failed as well. I've kind of got a bit of maybe a morbid fascination in that too. I've got a lot of, Philips CDI and Atari Jaguar and stuff like that. All these systems where, a group of people put their heart and soul into that project for a good year or two, only for it to completely fail on the market and not to have a big user install base. And I think exploring those kind of systems is quite interesting too. And, like Ravi said as well, kind of learning how they work. Because I was the same as, both of you guys. I got, books about learning Amiga DOS when I was a kid, and I'd read them front to back. And even today, I mean, I kind of forgot it for a bit. But when I got back into the Amiga around like 2007, 2008, I suddenly, all of it came back.
It's like riding a bike, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, totally. I mean, at first I was a bit like, Ed to edit the startup sequence, that's it. Yes. And it all came back. And now, I can jump in to Amiga DOS, and it's like, like Ravi said, riding a bike.
I think one thing that Dan does that is really good is he goes beyond stock. So like he said, he'll fill up like that 4000 with all the cards and have it running at the highest level, but get it all working. That's the key. Actually
customized work
finish it. That's,
network cards in there, which is insane. USB ports I've got on it now as well. Faster CPU. I sometimes have it playing internet radio in the corner of my room, which is something that it couldn't have done when it was new. So I think there's definitely an element of kind of pushing it to its limits too, and just using it sometimes. I mean, often I'll if I'm trying to write something. I've done a couple of articles recently, and even doing my taxes, obviously being self-employed, tax returns are never a fun thing to do. And generally, I really struggle to focus on doing stuff that I find really boring. So if I'm trying to, in Excel, and I'm trying to do my tax return in there, suddenly I've got a Facebook message in the corner on my Mac. Yeah. I'll check, see who that is. Oh, tweets come in. I'll reply to that. And I just completely lose focus on what I'm doing. So often I will use, I'll turn everything off, maybe use my Amiga 1200 that's not connected to the internet, sit down for like a whole day on a Saturday and do my accounts on that. And then, transfer that over to my Mac to kind of sort it all out. But there's definitely an element of that kind of isolation and just focusing on one task that I like.
I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good point. I've now got an image of Dan handing in his tax return to the HMRC on a double density, because it would have been high density, double density floppy with a self-written label, Dan's Taxes 2022,
formatted in Amiga DOS.
That's the kind of thing. When I first went round to Dan's house and he had all this technology laid out, I was like, "You've got it working? You've actually got that working, and that bit actually works?" Because I'd always visit people and it would be like, "Oh well, I've got this working on it, but that's broken, that's broken." And Dan's really good at, getting it all complete. And I'm the king of projects that haven't been finished, so it's pretty admirable to kind of just see his stuff and be like, "Wow."
Yeah, I've always kind of stressed out a bit if something isn't kind of in the state that I want it to be. Like even if my main PC breaks, it ruins my day. And I'll literally, I won't do any work.
Force yourself to get it.
I'll cancel appointment. I'll sit there until it's sorted. Yeah, otherwise I can't settle. So I've always had kind of an element of that, I suppose. But also what you said, James, about, you mentioned that PDA that you got. I got an Apple Newton a few years ago because I remember playing with those in, Ryman's the Stationers when I was a kid and thinking how cool they were. And now that the fact that I can own one, it's kind of a childhood dream kind of complete, even though not many people would want to own an Apple Newton either now or then, actually.
I do have one question, of course. You've got a Newton. Did you manage to write "beat up Martin"?
I think I did try that in my video, actually, but yeah, I think it worked. Unfortunately, I have one of the slightly later Newtons. I think with the slightly corrected firmware, so it wasn't quite as bad as those original ones, but yeah, they weren't the best.
But it is fascinating. We can now look at those devices and again look at the successes, look at the failures like the Sinclair QL, look at the things that, we can laugh about now to an extent, like how cheesy maybe some old games are, but also those, as you both said, those memories and, using the systems for things that you might not expect. I mean, I remember, was it Wordsworth on the Amiga?
Yeah.
I have a fond memory of helping my friend's mum write a letter to her employer. I can't remember what it was for. It was her CV. And she wanted to make it look like she'd handwritten it. So I was like, "Oh, you can change the font." And, why would you do that? But, yeah, because she wanted it handwritten, looking like it was handwritten, and in blue ink. Well, that's great, but you're printing it on a dot matrix printer. That ain't going to look handwritten, love.
And all the fonts look identical as well.
Yeah, right. Because, again, going back to, I still have a printer, but I can guarantee you not many people actually still bother with having a printer. I've got a laser, but, my early Amiga days were Citizen Swift. I think we had the 24. We had a colour Citizen Swift printer.
I've actually got a guy that I'm going to go and pick 2 Citizen printers up off for free. He's actually given away his old kind of accounts printers and stuff. And I used to love that carbon copy kind of paper where you'd have, you get 2 copies out of it. I just thought that was awesome. With the kind of...
I love the sound of dot matrices as well. That's tractor feed paper. Even the sound of a dot matrix, that takes me back to being at school again. I think we went to, when we last moved house, and we went to the bank to get our mortgage approved. And they printed some stuff out on a dot matrix, weirdly, in Barclays. It's only about 4 or 5 years ago. They still use it for some reason in there to print a certain document out. But hearing the sound of it, I was suddenly like, God, that takes me back.
It really, and again, it's, as you say, it's like transporting you back to your past or exploring systems that you heard about. There are systems that I would love to play with now, that maybe if I didn't experience, like I experienced a BBC Master. That's what we had in primary school. But, going back to things like the ZX Spectrum, I've never touched the ZX Spectrum, which is one of the reasons, not to plug Neil too hard. The royalty checks need to keep coming in here. But, going down to somewhere like the Cave, or there's lots of wonderful retro computing museums. And that's the thing. This isn't a small little group of people anymore. This is a big... I don't want to say industry, but this is a big community.
And I also think it is in the niche of people that are interested in that. But the amount of people that I've either gone out with a drink with, or I've gone round to a meal and met other friends of people, and they've said, "Oh, what are you into?" And I talk about it, and suddenly they're telling me about, "Oh, I used to remember this piece of technology that we had memories of this game," and everybody's got in their head, because it was all part of us. Everybody's got that kind of history, and apart from the new people, but a lot of the new kids and stuff, they're doing what I was doing, which was looking back at the stuff before me, and I think that's really interesting as well, because when I was younger, I'd be like studying all of the earlier computer systems as well when I really got into computing, and I think there's going to be a big audience of kids doing that, and that's going to continue. Like we had a guy on the podcast that said in the future AI is going to start studying retro computers, because that's its birth, that's its kind of father, and that's the basis that it started on. So yeah, I think it's always going to have an interest, and really good stuff.
And just imagining like Google's DeepMind, playing Manic Miner on a Spectrum emulator.
Once artificial intelligence becomes a thing, it's going to turn around and go, "Who was my father?" And then it would look back and go, "Oh, the Spectrum." Early AI in games.
Gosh, I've just got this image now of Google going, "What on earth is a BBC Micro?"
Yeah.
And finding old, was it the Computer program, which is the series that accompanied the Micro at the BBC? Yeah.
And Micro Live came after it, didn't it?
That's right. But again, like, that's something you get, just going back to what you talked about earlier about the British scene. There's so much of a British scene, like the BBC Micro, that didn't really have an impact in the same way over in the States. And I think, I can't remember who it was talking, it might have been LGR, but in the States, because, and I think I've mentioned this many times on the show, but because the States at the time was more affluent, it was more common to see floppy disks in the States. Most people had floppy disks, whereas over here, we were tape. Floppy disks were not common until you started getting in. Would it be fair to say until like the ST and the Amiga made them, built in?
That's the first time I had a disk drive, because I remember, on my Plus 4, it was cassette tapes, and my friends who had Amstrads and Spectrums and that kind of thing, all cassette tape based. And I think if you wanted to buy a disk drive for your Commodore 64, I've got a feeling they were about £400, back in the late 80s. So it was, more than the price of the machine often. I'd use them at school on the BBC Micros, but it really wasn't until I got my Amiga when I had, an actual built-in floppy drive on it.
I went to the Vintage Computer Festival East in America recently in New Jersey, and there wasn't any cassette stuff there at all. It was all very floppy based, and it was seen as a bit of a kind of oddity that people would be using cassettes, and it was a total different kind of scene, and it was very, like, the computing was very about like less kind of garden shed fiddly and like kind of just getting it working or kind of bashing it together British style, where the American was very corporate kind of stuff, and having big networks and big machines, and being a network administrator, where in the UK it seemed it was a lot of people with individual micros just trying to push them as much as possible.
Although I do remember really wanting a floppy drive, and in my Plus 4's manual there was a picture of a 1551 like floppy drive that was the drive that was made for that machine that are quite rare. But my dentist, weirdly enough, actually ran all of their accounts and reception on a Commodore Plus 4, and they had the floppy drive, and they had a printer, they had the official monitor, and I'd go in, waiting for my dentist appointment, looking at the setup there in reception, thinking, "Oh, I'd love to have that at home." I'd all just like drool over it. And then one day I went in, probably around 1990, 91, and Mum took me in one day, and the Plus 4 had gone. And there was probably an Amstrad PC or something there instead. And I remember saying to the dentist, like, "Oh, what happened to your Commodore setup?" He went, "Oh, we replaced it with a PC." I said, "Oh, what did you do with it?" He said, "Oh, we threw it on the skip." I was like, "Oh," I said, "I would have loved that." He said, "Well, if you'd have asked for it, you could have had it." And I've kicked myself for 30. I mean, I've got the floppy drive and the printer and that now, but I had to wait a long time to track them down. But I went home and nearly cried after that as a kid.
Oh, and of course back then no one would have thought, oh, we should keep hold of this because one day it's going to be valuable. I mean, I've said this many times. I think when we first chatted, Dan, I said I wish that if I could time travel, go back and say to my dad, hey, don't get rid of the 600.
I've thrown machines out. I threw when I went to university. I think I threw 2 Amiga 1200s in the bin, an Amiga 500. In the early 2000s, this was. Just because I thought I'm never going to use them again. And I thought, and they weren't selling for, they might go for a $5 in the local paper or something or on eBay, but there wasn't really any interest 20 years ago in them.
No, it's only been probably, 1,200 prices now. I'm like, how much? And that's before as we talked about, that's before you start looking at any of the upgrades, any of the accelerators. So, in the aim to keep this episode under an hour, to really call itself retro in under an hour, let's look at. I guess I want to ask you both. First, Dan. Obviously, we've all got our fond systems, but what would you say in your time, sort of collecting retro and talking about retro? What would you say is maybe your favourite or most oddball system that you've either been able to pick up or have had the privilege of using at some point?
Well, I've got, I mentioned that the Philips CDI before, which I've always found a really interesting platform. And that was originally it wasn't meant to be a console. It was like a home multimedia device. And I remember seeing these around in the early 90s when there was this market they predicted was going to be a massive thing. And Commodore had their platform, the CD-TV, and Philips released a CDI. And the aim originally was that, kids would use it for loading encyclopedias on the family TV on CD-ROM or looking at atlases and that kind of thing. And I remember seeing some demos and seeing video running on the CDI and stuff as well as a kid, but they were very expensive. I think they retail for about £600. So I didn't actually own one of those, but we did. A friend of mine had a CD-TV, which I used to borrow from him. I'd give him my Amiga 500 for a couple of weeks and I'd use the CD-TV. So I've always found those that market that never emerged, because obviously, that multimedia living room device market just didn't exist.
No.
And both of those machines lost, billions for the parent companies. And I've done videos about both the CD-TV and the CDI. So I think I've always found that story quite interesting. This market that all these companies poured all their resources in. I think I read, Philips, it was a colossal amount of money they lost on it. And they tried to make the CDI platform work until the late 90s. I think they kept it on the market for about 8 years, lost billions on it. But I think, no matter how hard they pushed it, there just wasn't a market there for it. So I think I do find those two devices particularly interesting, and they're quite niche as well, I imagine.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, though, when we look to where we are today, where, those multimedia platforms in the living room, okay, you're not getting maybe the encyclopedias, but things like, streaming video, TV, if you've got any sort of games console, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it the case that the PlayStation 2 I always hold up as a great example of where games console had almost a second life, in that people would buy PlayStation 2s not necessarily as a console, but as a more affordable DVD player.
Yeah, it was cheaper than a standard DVD player. And I think the PS3 was the same. That was the cheapest Blu-ray player on the market when that launched.
Yeah, and they were great devices. But now, we look at, we've got things like Apple TVs and Rokus. And, when we look at, I don't know the last time I ever bought any sort of encyclopedia CD. I think, to be honest, I think the last time I ever had one was in Carter 95. But now we just watch YouTube for this stuff or go on Wikipedia.
I think it's interesting to trace where technology came from, because, stuff like Wikipedia probably wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Encarta, you could say, that digital encyclopedia. And I mentioned the Sinclair QL before, and that's got one claim to fame, that Linus Torvalds had that as his first machine.
Yes.
And because there was barely any software on it, he started programming, and obviously that led to him creating Linux, which is now used everywhere around the world. So you could say that, without the Sinclair QL, Linux probably wouldn't exist today.
Which is fascinating. And, just to back that up, you might not think it, but, don't think of Linux as just desktop Linux. The chances are your TV is running some form of Linux. Android is effectively based on Linux. Most anything smart has probably got some form of a Linux underpinning.
The server that's hosting this podcast now probably runs on Linux.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah, I don't know who Squadcast host with, but it's probably a Linux-based OS. Because Apache, just the impact it's had. And then, of course, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, wasn't he on a Next?
Yeah, Nextcube, which again, Steve Jobs' company that he set up after Apple, generally regarded as, no one bought the machines, very niche, very expensive, regarded as a bit of a failure. But without that, the World Wide Web wouldn't exist, and probably Apple wouldn't exist today without Next technology.
Mac OS 10, as we know it now, or just Mac OS, wouldn't exist without Next Step.
So, it is Next Step pretty much.
Yeah, well, that's my kind of choice as well. Like Apple, because I really got into the kind of Amiga Apple emulation because they shared a lot of stuff, and you could. I used to have a board called an M-Plant, which was on the 2000, and you could have a Apple running on your Amiga, and it actually ran a bit faster. But I never had the original Macs, and I've got into PowerPC stuff. Huge Apple fanboy. Everything around me is Apple at the moment, but I have just got myself an Apple 512K Macintosh.
Oh, lovely!
And I really want to kind of get into that world because they're just, I saw them as kind of a very American thing, a bit inferior because they were black and white. I was a bit prejudiced against them back in the day, but now looking at them, they're so beautiful, and you see what Apple's kind of done with its approach of software and the kind of walled garden approach that really works today. And back then, just as a design of them, the style of them, it's just so nice. And that's one thing that I really want to get into, classic Apple, and try and push them as much as I push the Amigas as well.
There are some wonderful things you can do. And in fact, I was talking in the episode before this one, talking with Dan Vincent from Userlandia. We were talking about some of the things, like some of the SCSI options now.
Was it Blue SCSI? That's one that's meant to be amazing, I've heard.
Yeah, Blue SCSI and all sorts of mods that you can do to these classic Macs. Steve Jobs would probably spin his grave if you thought you'd modded a Mac because, but again, that's a whole world that, again, here in the UK, we probably didn't, Macs were not as accepted. People say, when we talk to American guests, we had iMacs in our classroom. Well, that's not what we experienced. I think probably all three of us at some point in our school career probably had either BBC Micros or Acorn Archimedes.
Yeah, definitely at school. Like my when I got to college, they had a Mac for audio production, and that was one of the digital audio ones. But that was much later on, and that was when there were all the colourful Macs and stuff like that. The classic Mac range was completely alien to me. It's like something from a foreign land, and all really nicely designed with curves and stuff.
It's my auntie ran a print shop, a branch of Prontoprint, who are like a high street print shop, and I used a Mac there probably when I was about 7 years old, and I remember that was the first time I'd ever used a computer mouse. Drew my name on the Paint program. That kind of sticks in my mind. But yeah, after that, similar to what Ravi said, then it was the kind of G3, G4 Macs when I got to college. It was, and we had like a multimedia room full of them. And I remember actually, I could go in there on like a weekend, and there was probably about like 20, 30 PowerPC Macs in there. I'd have the room to myself usually, so I'd have them all running Napster, downloading music on the weekend. That's generally what I did with them. But
so you're the one who got the college all those legal notices, right?
Then burning them all to a data CD and taking them home. So yeah, bolstered my music collection quite a bit that way.
Oh wow, the stuff that we owe to a lot of these companies. I mean, I talked earlier about how Acorn, Ravi, that M1 Mac that you're using right now, you owe that very existence of that to Acorn.
And you guys have chatted about Acorn and in this podcast, and that gives me the feels as well, because my whole entire primary school, it wasn't BBC Micros, it was Acorns, and then it was up to the Acorns with CD-ROM as well and stuff. So that's a whole area that I've not dipped my toe back into. I really need to, because I've not used RISC-OS in so long, and I could tell that's going to be a big hit of nostalgia when I get back on it.
Even that you can run that on a Raspberry Pi today.
Cheating though, isn't it?
Well, again, like James said, that, the Raspberry Pi is a descendant of the Acorn Archimedes.
Yeah,
really.
I just want the old big machine, huge fans and stuff.
I can see Ravi carting off an Acorn Archimedes back. And that's the other thing, of course, is as we wrap up, is what would you say to people who are interested in retro computing and want to start collecting but have no idea where to start? Is there any top tips either of you could give for people? Because, Dan, we've talked about, how to collect Amigas. But what would you say maybe some golden rules for people in fanning the flames of your retro passion?
I would say go for stock and then start from there. But also look on places like Facebook Marketplace. And like you also mentioned museums. Go to a museum, try out stuff and see what you like, because they're going to have every machine. Some of the stuff that we've seen at shows and stuff just totally brings back memories. And when we first started doing this, going to like video games events, I don't think we'd ever used a Neo Geo before and stuff like that. And just seeing them and being able to sit down and play on them for a bit, then you kind of get a feel for it and stuff before you go out and invest and buy absolutely everything and all the latest speed upgrades. Kind of just go for the stock, look on somewhere like Facebook Marketplace that people aren't really going to, be high selling it or might not have the massive knowledge about it, and then just pick something up and have a play.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of doing it, because I played, first used a Sinclair QL at the Cambridge Centre for Computing History. So,
oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the first time I ever used one of those, and I used a Silicon Graphics workstation there as well, which is something I'd really want in my collection, but they are ridiculously expensive and very big. So, yeah, going to museums, there's so many good ones all around the world now where you can go and get hands-on with these machines. They let you actually use them. And also, there's emulators as well. If you think you're interested in the platform, there are emulators for pretty much anything.
Even in the browser. Like, there's a lot of emulators that are just browser-based,
Yeah, so you can get a kind of a feel for the system on there and maybe what the games or the software's like, so it might be a good way to kind of dip your toe in. And then there are really good Facebook groups and forums as well for pretty much any retro platform you can think of, where... So that's one of my favourite things about it, I think. As much as I love the memories and I love the machines, I love the friendship aspect of it as well. And, there are user groups all over the country now. Ravi actually runs one here in Nottingham, the Robin Hood Amiga group, where, every couple of months a bunch of us get together and show off our machines and new hardware and stuff we've got for it too. So, yeah, look out for those communities as well, because I think definitely for me, one of the biggest draws to the retro scene is that community aspect and making friends as well.
Absolutely, because I've made so many good connections through the retro community, and I joke about paying Neil royalties, but the reality is I wouldn't have spoken to Ravi through Discord DMs if it hadn't been for being on RMC Retro.
Yeah.
I think Dana reached out to you originally via Twitter, but obviously, it's building those relationships and getting to know people.
And it is kind of like user groups as well, and it's that shared knowledge and excitement. So like Dan bought his CD32 and it wasn't working, and somebody Pillock actually he's got the CD32 working, and he's just done that just for the sake of it, and it's like you're both really happy about it, and it's like achievement, and that's what that kind of stuff was like, and that's what RMC feels like as well, like a kind of Discord user group.
And what not astounds me, but what always makes me smile is that you've not only got the people like us who were fans of those systems in there, but you've got the people, some of the times you've got the people behind me, like, my favourite example is Mike Daly. Is it that? Yeah. Who's, the Lemmings, he's going to, if he ever meets me, he's going to hit me for calling him this. The Lemmings guy. But that's not. It's not.
DMA Designs, wasn't he, Mike Daly?
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
And GTA as well, yeah.
Indeed, which, of course, people forget that GTA and Lemmings came from the same studio, which I still find hilarious. Anyway, gents, where can people find the Retro Hour, and where can people find you both on the social media platform things? Yeah,
the Retro Hour is on pretty much any podcast platform. If you just search for it in your app of choice, or you can ask your smart speaker. We're on those as well. Or you can just go to our website, theretrohour.com. We both have YouTube channels as well. If you just search for Dan Wood in YouTube, you'll probably find me top of the list.
You just search for Ravi Abbott as well, and you'll find me. But also, we've got like a Discord community ourselves, which is quite like a user group that we're talking about. So you can come on there and just chat about your systems, and we've got a Patreon community as well, and they're really awesome. They're always like sharing technological advances that they've done with older systems.
It put us to shame, don't they? Often we're like, yeah, well, I glass by them.
Yeah, definitely. Some of their collections are like, wow.
And that's, thank you both. And we'll put links, of course, to Retro and to both Dan and Ravi's YouTubes and their Twitter on the episode notes. I just love this community. I love how interactive it is. And it's, you know, as I said before, Crosswise isn't explicitly a retro show, but some of my favourite recording times have been going back into that nostalgia. It's been fantastic. Yeah. So thank you both for joining me. And again, Ravi, thank you for interrupting your ironing. Very much appreciated.
No problem. I'll get back to it now. It's a bit cooler anyway. So.
Cheers, James.
No problem at all. So, folks, you can follow us on Twitter, CrosswiresMG. Head over to crosswires.net for the show notes for this episode and all our other episodes. You can go and check out all the past episodes, including Dan's chat with us about the Amiga. And, you know, if you're feeling adventurous, you can go and listen to Reese from Control Alt Reese talking about the Atari as well, if that's your thing, you know. You can email us podcast@crosswires.net and head over to crosswires.net/YouTube for our YouTube channel. There will be content coming soon. In fact, this is the first episode ever recorded on the Focusrite Vocaster, so there's definitely going to be content coming up about that soon. So do check it out. Until the next time, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.